And Ezra said, "You are God, you alone. You have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth and all that is on it, the seas and all that is in them. To all of them you give life, and the host of heaven worships you. You are the God who chose Abram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. And you found his heart faithful before you and made with him a covenant to give to his descendants the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, and the Girgashite. And you have fulfilled your promise, for you are righteous. And you saw the distress of our ancestors in Egypt and heard their cry at the Red Sea. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land, for you knew that they had acted insolently against our ancestors. You made a name for yourself, which remains to this day. And you divided the sea before them so that they passed through the sea on dry land. But you threw their pursuers into the depths, like a stone into mighty waters. Moreover, you led them by day with a pillar of cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire, to give them light on the way in which they should go. You came down also upon Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven, and gave them right ordinances and true laws, good statutes and commandments, and you made known your holy Sabbath to them, and gave them commandments and statutes and a law through your servant Moses. For their hunger, you gave them bread from heaven, and for their thirst, you brought water for them out of the rock. And you told them to go in to the land that you swore to give them." Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each heart be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Our practice for today is the practice of getting lost, of going out into the wilderness. I'm not sure any of us would choose to get lost, but most of us would say that there are lessons we learn whenever we do. Have you ever gotten lost? I'm not talking metaphorically. Have you ever been physically lost? Have you ever lost someone else? You all heard my story about my brother, which we'll laugh about to this day. My brother has several stories of getting lost. He once got lost in a field of corn. Not recommended. Perhaps it is because he has a proclivity for wandering and daydreaming when he's wandering. But I have my own story about getting lost. And I don't know that any of us found it funny. I was in the 4th or 5th grade and the fair was in town. You know, the kind of fair that goes from small town to small town with rides that no one should feel safe riding and more cotton candy and funnel cakes than you could eat in a year. Yeah, that kind of fair. I'm the oldest of 3, and us 3 siblings had fun going from ride to ride until we got to what was advertised as a haunted house. This was not like any of the haunted houses that we have now, you know, made of old houses with paid actors doing jump scares. This was like a train car that had been converted into a bad carnival's version of a haunted house. Now, perhaps my 9-year-old brain has conflated some of the details, but it was not the sort of ride that I wanted to go on. But my brothers desperately wanted to go in. I had no adult to stay with me outside, so I was forced to go along with it. Knowing my one brother's tendency to wander, my mother held tightly to him with one hand and had our youngest brother, who was probably 5, by the other hand. That left me to cling to my mother's purse strap as I walked behind her, and we entered one of the darkest, scariest places I had ever been in my entire 9 years. Once we got inside, It was clear that it was a twisting maze of hauntedness, and they had packed as many people in it as possible, all trying to find their way out. You can see where this is going, right? About halfway through, I got bumped by someone, and I lost my grip on my mother's purse strap. I tried finding her, and then panic set in. I tried finding my own way out, but I kept getting stuck in dead ends. I finally went into full-blown panic mode, and all I could do was pound my fists against the wall and cry. And then someone grabbed my hand. She reassured me that she would get me out, and she led me quietly through the rest of the haunted house until we reached the end and daylight and my mother and brothers. She was a high schooler at our local high school, and she was in her cheerleader uniform. I don't know her name, and I don't even remember if I spoke to her after she got me out. But I do know that she was my rescuer. The people of God had their own version of getting lost. Their ancestors had traveled to many destinations in search of food. Joseph had been sent into the hands of their enemies by his own brothers, but in a twist of fate, ended up saving his family from famine. It's here in Egypt that the people of God stayed until a new Pharaoh came into power and became afraid of the people of God overthrowing him. Depending on who you talk to, the people of God had grown weary of always moving from place to place when resources were lacking. Some of them would have rather stayed where there was consistent food instead of set out to yet another unknown place. Perhaps the people of God were already feeling physically lost even before they set out into the wilderness. Most of us need a sense of where home is. And for generations, home for the people of God was wherever the food was. Even Joseph, who had died in Egypt, wanted his bones moved when God called them to move forward. We know that there's more than one way to be lost. While many of us have experienced getting lost physically, many more of us understand the feeling of getting lost emotionally. I first felt lost in an emotional sense when I was 16. Up until then, I had been the rule follower, the one who kept the peace, and the one who had it all together. I grew up in a culture where straight, white men had power over everyone else. So when I found myself in an unhealthy relationship with a boy a year older than me, I did not have the knowledge or the tools to know how to get out. I didn't even know I was in a bad relationship until much later. Slowly, I was isolated away from my friends and family until I had no one in my inner circle but the person I was dating. I no longer knew who I was. If I had been able to speak to myself or even look at myself in the mirror, I wouldn't have recognized myself. I had become a shell of myself. Unlike the story where I got physically lost in the haunted house, I had no rescuer. I had to come to my own rescue. But I never would have done it if not for the fact that I had to protect someone else, the baby I was carrying at the age of 17. Perhaps it was like the people of God feeling emotionally lost. They had been in a bad relationship with the Pharaoh for so long that they couldn't recognize themselves anymore. They would have stuck with what they knew, forced labor, to feel a sense of security. Don't misunderstand. The story of the people of God in forced labor tells of a people who are crying out to God. But I don't think they felt like they had the tools or the knowledge to do anything about it. Even when the Pharaoh ordered the midwives to get rid of any baby boys born, the people of God were not ready to step out into the unknown. It wasn't until Moses grew up and had a conversation with God in a burning bush that the people of God felt like they had the tools, or the person, Moses, to move beyond their current circumstance. But they had to be willing, and they had to convince the Pharaoh to let them go. We've heard stories of getting physically and emotionally lost, but we have one more way of getting lost to cover. And it's perhaps the toughest one to deal with. When we are spiritually lost, we feel as if we have lost our North Star. We have no compass to show us the way, and it can feel like God is very distant, or not even here. Sometimes I feel as if I have spent more of my life being spiritually lost than ever feeling spiritually found. In September of 2004, my youngest was born after a very difficult pregnancy. I had spent over half of the pregnancy on bed rest due to preterm labor. When she was born, I thought all would be well. And then a few months later, I developed a hand tremor. A few more months later, and I had a migraine that I couldn't get rid of. It stayed with me for over 3 months. Doctors were getting concerned and began talking about making sure that I didn't have a brain tumor. I had MRIs, blood tests, every test you can think of, and they couldn't figure out what symptoms were from. I got shuffled from neurologist to neurologist, where they initially thought that I had multiple sclerosis, but they couldn't make a definitive diagnosis. At several points, doctors told me it was psychosomatic, which is doctors speak for it's all in your head. After one of those appointments, I found myself in my pastor's office in tears. I just kept repeating, I don't know what God wants me to do. I was angry at God. Here I had, for most of my life, followed the rules. I was young, in my mid-20s, and I should be thriving. Instead, I could barely make it through the day, caring for my 3 kids. I lost vision in one eye several times. I had to relearn how to walk 3 times. And still, they had no answers, no medication to prevent whatever was attacking me from the inside. I began to believe that maybe I really was crazy. I'd been through a lot, and I didn't even know if I wanted to believe in a God who would just ignore someone crying out. I was as spiritually lost as you could get. I stopped attending church for a time. I wrestled with the idea of a God who would allow so much suffering, not just for myself, but for others. The people of God had only known a distant God up until the time that they stepped out into the wilderness. Much of their religious rituals were based on the idea that one must appease their God through sacrifices and offerings, just like many of the other religions in that day. But God made God's self known to Moses, and God promised the people of God that God would be with them. And it wasn't just the usual reminder of God will be there. It was a physical presence. God was with them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, a physical reminder that they are literally not alone. Obviously, God did not show up to me during the time I was struggling in a pillar of fire or cloud. I wrestled for years in the wilderness where I felt like I was very much alone. But at the same time that I was struggling with even the existence of God, I was also feeling a nudge to get to know God and myself deeper. It happened slowly. I got asked to help during Sunday school with our preschoolers, and I, to my surprise, said yes. A little later, I got asked if I'd be willing to be the coordinator of children's ministry. And again, I said yes. And I helped launch a new curriculum at our church, Worship and Wonder, which you all know well. There were plenty of times where I still felt like God was ignoring me, but there were glimpses of a God who was bigger than I had ever understood before, in other people. And eventually, I began to see God within me. When I learned who I was on the inside, beloved, strong, resilient, I began to understand that I was more than whatever was going on with me physically. I felt connected to who I was in here. And I came to the realization that I didn't need to know the name for whatever medical condition I had to know who I was. And then, because life works mysteriously like that, I got diagnosed with a severe form of psoriatic arthritis that was affecting my spine. I'm so grateful that I have medication to help prevent further damage. And the diagnosis didn't change who I was. It changed how easily I was able to move through the world, but it didn't change how I felt in my heart, in my soul. Yesterday, at Marty Hermansdorfer's celebration of life, we spoke of an enduring, nurturing love that our beloved Marty shared with others, and the enduring love that God has for us. It's a love that is full of grit, determination, and a lot of stubbornness. And I believe that it is the type of love that we don't fully understand until we've gotten a little lost along the way. For me, it is the type of love that bears witness to the journey, especially the times we feel lost. And it is the love that reminds us that we were never actually lost to begin with. We just had to be found, to find ourselves, to find each other, and to find the love that God has for us.